Why do social groups behave the way they do? It's a question sociologists have been trying to answer for more than a century. To ensure that their inquiries produce accurate and reliable findings, sociologists use research methods and tools instead of relying on common sense and casual observations. The use of these tools and methods in the exploration of social issues is what makes sociology a scientific discipline. People typically rely on common sense to make judgment about other people's behavior. But common sense doesn't necessarily lead to the truth. For example, many people assume that welfare encourages poor teenage girls to have children outside of marriage, or that the differences in the behavior of females and males is simply human nature, or that couples who live together before they marry have more successful marriages. But sociologists have conducted studies on these subjects and found that these assumptions aren't true. Why are these findings believable? Why should we consider them more trustworthy than common sense observations?
It's different from common sense because we sometimes believe in things because we think that's the way it is. And sociology really enables you to study a particular social phenomena and record that activity. And it's through the recording of that activity that you begin to understand it in a different perspective, other than just from the eye.
The knowledge that you get from sociology differs from common sense because it is based on empirical data.
Simply put, empiricism is based on evidence, not assumptions. But evidence alone isn't enough. To ensure a reliable means for establishing truth, information must be collected using a disciplined, systematic, and objective process. Sociologists use the scientific method to collect and analyze information.
The scientific method is critical for studying social issues. Sociology is a social science, and part of the way science progresses is through a methodology that means others can attempt to replicate the types of research that have been accomplished.
The heart of sociological inquiry is research.
Research is the vehicle by which we can go beyond common sense and opinion.
The researcher wants to engage in what I call research and not me-search. In other words, finding out more about my topic as opposed to finding out more about what I already think.
With its emphasis on learning through observation and experimentation, the scientific method is the research method of choice for most quantitative researchers. Quantitative research relies on statistical analysis, and its focus is objective, concise, and narrow.
I'm really happy that you're here today, and as you know, we have been talking a lot about HIV and AIDS in the urban community, and I'm very interested in getting some feedback from you regarding...
With some topics, however, quantitative research limits what sociologists can learn about group behavior. In that case, sociologists turn to qualitative research, which is more subjective with a complex and broader focus. A researcher may observe a group in its natural setting over a long period of time and even participate in its activities. Immersion in the subject group is the cornerstone of a popular form of qualitative research called ethnography.
Ethnography is very exciting in that it really allows you to observe and study a population and basically document their every move and their every experience. And in documenting their experience, you really bring voice to their experience. You begin to give insight into their experience from their perspective.
Ethnographic research is nothing more than the science of cultural description. How do people see their world? And how can I see their world the way they see it? In many ways, I can't get into their skin, of course, but I can get as close to the data as possible, which is what ethnography allows me to do.
Some people will argue that ethnographic methods or field research methods are less rigorous or they're more subjective. So in other words, they deviate from the scientific method. But I think that by systematically observing any setting, regardless of how you collect the data, regardless of how representative your sample is, that you can still get something of scientific merit or scientific worth out of the setting.
To the sociologist, both quantitative and qualitative inquiries make important contributions to the discipline of sociology.
Both perspectives are very important in order to understand the social world, and both have key advantages. One of the major advantages of quantitative research is that you can get a lot of information on a lot of people fairly quickly. One of the advantages of qualitative research is while you're actually in the process of gathering information, if you discover that there's another piece of information I really should ask this respondent or ask this subject, qualitative research allows for that to happen.
By compelling sociologists to be methodical and focused on observation and measurement, sociological inquiry helps researchers explore and explain social behavior and its true consequences. When sociologists engage in quantitative research, they must carefully follow the scientific method to ensure the integrity of their findings. The process begins with asking a question. For sociologist Juanita Firestone, who has lifelong ties to the military, the question was this: under what conditions does sexual harassment occur in the military?
I have always been interested in gender stratification, and within organizations, sexual harassment is one of the means of keeping stratification strong within an organization. It defines women as different, keeps them out on the periphery, outside the main function of the organization.
Having formulated a question, Firestone's next step was to review the literature to see what had been written on the subject. As she and her husband, Richard Harris, read the literature, they were struck by the apparent relationship between the two basic types of harassment, quid pro quo and environmental harassment.
There's quid pro quo. That's the really nasty stuff. Gee, if you don't do what I want sexually, then I won't promote you, or I won't give you a raise, or I will fire you. Something negative will happen. Then there's the environmental harassment that people are less certain about. For the legal definition, it involves making someone uncomfortable because you either speak or present images or something of a sexual nature that really have no place within a particular structure.
Based on their review of the literature, the sociologists were able to formulate a hypothesis. If environmental harassment is removed, quid pro quo harassment will be reduced or eliminated. The next step was to select a research method.
If we want to generalize and have a basic understanding of what produces sexual harassment and people's responses to sexual harassment, then quantitative analysis can help us.
The information gathering phase of the scientific method can often be one of the most difficult. But the sociologist's work was simplified by the military's propensity to study itself. Virtually all of the quantitative data they needed had already been gathered. Most illuminating were studies done in 1988 and 1995 involving 20,000 cases from all branches of the military. That allowed them to move rapidly to the analysis phase and discover some important findings.
What we found was incredible because well over 60% of individuals, of women, regardless of rank, regardless of position, regardless of anything, say they had experienced sexual harassment. And rank didn't protect women, so officers were equally likely to experience sexual harassment as enlisted. We did find that a certain proportion of men experienced sexual harassment, not to the same extent that women did, but certainly some men also experienced harassment. If the senior officer is the person who's reported as harasser, then we find more incidents taking place.
Through statistical analysis of the data, the sociologists found evidence that supported their hypothesis. They were able to conclude that there was indeed a strong relationship between environmental and quid pro quo sexual harassment.
We were able to show that if environmental harassment wasn't present, virtually no quid pro quo incidences occurred.
By following the scientific method and using quantitative analysis, Juanita Firestone and Richard Harris were able to bring an objective focus to a controversial subject. Bluegrass music began in Appalachia and evolved into a musical form with followers all over the United States. Bluegrass is unique among American musical genres in that a large number of its fans get together to play and sing the music in informal jam sessions. What methods would a sociologist use to understand the complexities of such group interaction among bluegrass enthusiasts? For any sociologist, there are times when quantitative research methods can't reveal what he or she wants to know. Being an actual participant in a group is sometimes the most effective approach. That was the choice Robert Gardner made when he decided to conduct an ethnographic study of bluegrass music. Ethnography is a type of qualitative research.
I'm investigating how participation in a bluegrass festival setting and how cultural expression in general can tell us other things about social life.
Ethnographic research involves more than simply going out into the field and observing a given group or culture. First, the researcher must define the observer's role in the research.
I participated in the very same setting that I was researching. And through that, I was able to get an understanding of how it is an individual creates meaning from the experience of participating in bluegrass festivals or bluegrass music.
Once the researcher's role is defined, the next step is to define the problem.
I'm investigating how and why individuals are drawn into bluegrass music and what things define their participation.
At this point, the ethnographer must identify the theory that drives the inquiry. This may mean replicating or building on an earlier study, or it may mean formulating a new model or theory by which to conduct the study. This process helps the researcher determine how to structure the study, such as where to investigate the group, and how and when to use interviews. This is followed by a review of the literature.
In reviewing the literature, I essentially went to the library and got every article that I could find about bluegrass music or about bluegrass culture, and just sort of looked at holes in the literature, what wasn't being talked about, what perspectives weren't being offered, and I found that there was a lot of information that wasn't out there about bluegrass musical participation outside of Appalachia or outside of the South. So I'm looking at bluegrass music, bluegrass festivals in the West.
The next step involved selecting the information gathering tools, such as field observation, interviews, and a questionnaire.
When I was creating my questionnaire that I sent out to people, I started with some basic questions first. Why are you interested in bluegrass? When did you first begin listening to bluegrass? Describe your participation in festival life. How would you describe the community aspects of the bluegrass setting?
It's interesting because it's very much an underground community. And the connections on that are within that community are not explicit at all.
I left the questions open-ended, so people could sort of run with and take the question in any direction they felt necessary. Most of the data that I collected were just through participating at the festivals and at the musical jam sessions. I would carry a notebook with me frequently and just jot down interesting things that I saw, interesting things that people said.
Once he gathered all the information he needed, Gardner analyzed his data.
I began analyzing the data by compiling field notes, interviews, transcribed interviews that I had conducted, some of the survey questionnaires that I had sent out, and basically sat it down in front of me and said, okay, how can I make sense of this maze of information that I have? And began selecting and organizing and categorizing the data.
And what did Gardner's analysis reveal?
I did begin to see patterns emerging from the data. A lot of times I would see things that really were counterintuitive or things that contradicted what, my own beliefs and my own biases. I went in initially thinking that bluegrass music allows individuals to have discussions about politics, have discussions about things going on in their local community, and this is sort of driving part of my research, and I found that to not be the case because individuals explained that they don't like talking about politics when they're participating in this setting. They feel that that sets up divisions or creates divisions between people.
Based on his findings, what conclusions was Gardner able to draw about why individuals participate in bluegrass music?
People are seeking community, an alternative source of community in areas that can't necessarily be found within their local cities or within their local towns. And people have told me that they're seeking something that is an alternative to mainstream cultural forms, commercial country music, homogenized rock and roll, something that's a little bit more authentic.
By using qualitative research and ethnography, Robert Gardner was able to gain an understanding of group behavior among people who love bluegrass music. While sociologists generally choose either quantitative or qualitative methods for their research, some situations may call for both. This is called a mixed method research approach. Sociologists William Kornblum and Terry Williams decided to use this approach in their study of a drop-in homeless center located in the Grand Central Station neighborhood in Midtown Manhattan.
The overall question that we're trying to explore in this research is how can we help homeless people such that they get to have opportunities in their lives that will take them out of homelessness and get them back on their feet and help them secure housing and employment and counseling and health care.
Through qualitative ethnographic research, sociologist Terry Williams sought to understand the complexities of the homeless, those on the streets of the city, and those who dwell below these streets.
The population that I wanted to spend time with was a population that lived under the streets of New York. It's extremely important to be able to go into this world as a participant observer, to go into a kind of natural setting, if you will, and to have that prolonged contact with people, to get their stories, to transform those stories, or try to transform those stories so that a larger audience, policymakers, scholars, students, and others can relate to.
To help the sociologists focus on their research, they spent a lot of time researching material that had already been written about the homeless population.
When we began the research, we did a lot of review of existing literature. We also reviewed a lot of the research about controversies over homelessness. For example, we had to have a way of knowing before the center started how extensive the problem of homelessness was in the area, where the people were, where they were living on the streets or in the tunnels, in order to be able to document the situation before our intervention took place, and then how the situation of public homelessness changed as the center became more and more used by homeless people.
And my literature review led me to the following understanding, that one, we focus too much attention on where people lived, that we had to focus more on the individual themselves and look at some of the larger forces that shaped and or made them lose their homes.
After reviewing what research had been done about the homeless population, the sociologists narrowed their focus of study to two specific hypotheses.
One hypothesis is that if you offer homeless men and women alternative places to go, where they can feel secure and where they can receive the fulfillment of their needs, then you can begin to work with them to move them out of the bottom ranks of society and up into more socially constructive roles for themselves and for the society.
The second hypothesis the researchers investigated was equally important.
To the extent that we get homeless people coming into the drop-in center, as their number inside the center increases, the number of homeless people in the streets around the Grand Central Station area will decrease.
With their hypotheses in hand, Kornblum and Williams selected their methods for collecting the data that would determine if their educated guesses were correct.
The methods that we use in our research are dictated by the question, and that means counting. Demographic methods, counting of populations and looking at where they're distributed. We began counting homelessness in the Grand Central Station area and all the streets around it, and documented where people were sleeping and how many and what kinds of groups they were. And so we did a lot of preliminary demographic work.
While Kornblum focused on counting numbers, Williams was working to understand the people behind the numbers.
At one point in time, Grand Central Terminal was the key location for homeless people. And as I did my research, I noticed that they were also going under the floor. There were 5 levels underneath Grand Central Terminal. I made contact with people under those 5 levels, and that led me to provide a map in general that would tell me where populations that were homeless in this city lived, because it was clear that after midnight, many of these populations went other places, but nobody exactly knew where. Some went to shelters, but there was a particular population who felt imprisoned by shelters and were going to other locales, and this was literally under the streets.
After the sociologists gathered both quantitative and qualitative data, their analysis yielded important findings, richer than what either method could have revealed alone.
It's always a great struggle to convince people that we can rehabilitate and we can give a helping hand. A lot of people pay lip service to the idea of redemption and giving a helping hand, and they may even put some money up for it, but they don't want it to be in their backyard. They don't want it to be done within their sight. And so our constant struggle is to create a legitimate presence for ourselves in the community.
I guess the most profound transformation was that I saw people as human beings who were increasingly seen by the larger society as disposable. I could not do this research and not maintain a constant contact with people, that they were not just research subjects, and that I changed as a person. I changed as a writer, as a scholar. And that was a profound thing for me.
We rely on your writing because we don't write for others.
The sociologists' findings supported their hypothesis that if the center offered homeless people basic services such as food and shelter, many of them would become involved in the center's programs.
Now it's crystal clear at the many tiers. Now I'm focused without fear.
Once they become participants in the program, such as the writers program, we have a much higher probability of success getting them better employment and getting them opportunities that are going to eventually move them into permanent housing.
Book only goes for $1, and it's our anniversary issue here.
The researchers also found supporting evidence for their second hypothesis. They concluded that the number of homeless men and women on the streets decreased as the center's number of participants increased.
We've been able to show that As the center has become more and more successful and hosts an increasing number of homeless people, the number of homeless people hanging out on the streets around the Grand Central area has decreased.
By using a mixed method approach in their research, Kornblum and Williams were able to conduct a scientific sociological inquiry into the center's effectiveness and gain insight into what it means to be homeless. Based on this study, these sociologists learned that there are other important questions that have yet to be explored.
Homelessness among different groups in the society is something we need to know more about.
What would happen to any of us if we were to face loss of spouse, loss of job, loss of home? These are very powerful kind of changes in one's life. And so here were people finding the resilience to overcome that.
Every day we formulate conclusions about the world around us. Often we do this by making casual observations. We ask friends for their opinions. We form conclusions based on an article we've read or a newscast we've seen. But are such conclusions reliable? While casual approaches to research might seem helpful, sociologists use a variety of research methods to form their conclusions. Using empirical research methods, sociologists can ensure that the information they contribute to the discipline of sociology is reliable and sound.